Welcome back to the Small Business Toolbox. I'm Andy Mack and I've been self-employed for longer than I care to remember. On this channel we just have a little informal chat about, well, frankly, stuff that you probably should have been taught at school, but hopefully just a few bits and pieces that I've picked up over the years that you can benefit from if you're just starting out in business. So you've thought of an awesome business name, you've registered for self-employment in the UK, you've got yourself sorted with a business bank account. Well, it's time to start doing some work and actually get paid some money. And in order to get paid, you're probably going to have to generate your first invoice, and that's what this video is all about. I'm going to try and explain what an invoice is, how to make one, a couple of different examples of stuff that you need to include in an invoice. And later on in the video, I'm going to give you a little tip for my absolute favorite invoice numbering system, which just will make your life so much easier for managing your invoices. I'll tell you all about that later on, but let's start with some of the basics first. So, an invoice. This is kind of what an invoice looks like. You can print one out and send it to your customers through the post, or you can send them as a PDF electronically, or however you want to do it. There's lots of different ways of sending invoices to people. And an invoice essentially fulfills two different roles. It's a tax document and it's a legal document. From a tax perspective, it's required just to maintain your own accounts, and if you ever get audited by HMRC, then they might ask for a copy of all of the invoices that you've ever raised. And from a legal perspective, you're issuing a formal demand for payment from your customer. So above all, an invoice is essentially how you get paid. When you're talking about billing your customer, you're generally talking about giving them an invoice. You do some work, you issue an invoice, you get paid for the work. Simple as that. Most invoices these days will be electronically generated, but you can do paper invoices if you want. The main thing is you need to keep a copy of every invoice that you've raised, whether it's an electronic copy or a physical paper copy, that's entirely up to you. I just keep PDF copies of every invoice that I've raised, and that seems to do the job. Now, as a small business owner, you're probably only going to be generating, 3 or 4 invoices a month, maybe? Depends what you sell. But if you're in those sort of volumes, you really don't need to go overboard on fancy accounting software and stuff like that. A simple spreadsheet like Excel should do the job perfectly well. If you do generate a lot of invoices though, a more automated approach might be more sensible, using either your e-commerce software or dedicated accounting software, or as I found out with Tide bank account, I can now do invoices directly from my bank account. When you're just starting out though, you're going to have enough things to worry about without having to try and learn accountancy software. So just, I would say, keep things as simple as possible to start off with. A simple Excel spreadsheet will be fine. So I'll take you through everything you need to include on an invoice from a UK self-employed perspective. Obviously, if you're watching this in other parts of the world, the requirements might be a little bit different, but to be honest, I've dealt with many international invoices over the years, and they're all more or less the same. I am making the assumption that you're not VAT registered, because if you are earning over the VAT threshold of 85 grand a year, then you're probably going to be using accountancy software anyway. If you are VAT registered and you're planning on doing things the way I'm talking about doing things in this video, just bear in mind there are some additional requirements for VAT registered businesses, which I'm not going to cover off in detail. So let me talk you through it. I'm just going to take you through a sample invoice template which you can get off my Patreon if you want to use the one that I actually use for my businesses, or you can generate your own. It's relatively straightforward. So here's a really typical business invoice. Remember, it's not a VAT invoice, but for any other kind of sole trader type work, this should do the job. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight in yellow all of the absolutely essential things that you need to have on an invoice, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to, in pink, show you some of the optional things that you might want to think about including on an invoice. First of all, it sounds obvious, but an invoice should have the word invoice on it. You can call it something else if you want, but you do run the risk of not being paid, especially by businesses, if your invoice doesn't have the word invoice written on it. Secondly, obviously you want the customer's name and address, so you should have their company name, maybe even a contact name, or like their accounts payable department or something like that, but just make sure you've got the customer's full name and address on their invoice. You need to have an invoice date, and that's generally going to be the date that you prepared the invoice on. You also need to have a unique invoice number, and I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit more detail later on. Of course, you need to include your own business details. So in this example, I've got a company logo up the top here, but then I've also got my full business contact details down at the bottom here. So what I'm trading as, my business name, business address, business postcode, telephone number, email address, web address, just your full contact details, so there's no ambiguity about how the customer can get in touch with you. Then, of course, we need a description of the work we've actually done for the customer. So make that as detailed as you like, but you need enough information that the person in the accounts department paying you can work out what they're paying you for. So in this example, I've put design of company logo, including a design meeting. So what I've included here is the date of meetings that have been carried out, and also the supply date of the final product. It is a good idea to include the supply date on your invoices if possible, but just go into as much detail as you feel necessary for the job that you've done. You don't have to go as far as having quantity and unit price and total. You could just have a total figure. But again, it's good practice to go down the route of having this quantity field and then a unit field, and then the total automatically works itself out. And then if you've got lots of different products or services all on a single invoice, then just split them out. Here's another one here, design of company business cards, letterheads, brochures, delivered on, and then we've got a supply date again. And then of course, down at the bottom of the invoice, we've got the important one, the grand total amount due. And if you don't charge VAT, some companies can get a little bit confused about that because they're so used to dealing with VAT registered businesses. But if you're not VAT registered yet and you do business to business sales, then it might be a good idea to put on your invoice no VAT to pay. But that's not an essential thing. So I'm going to mark that in pink. However, your payment terms, it's one of those things that it's not required by law, but if you don't include payment terms, you could get paid in any random amount of time. So I would certainly deem your payment terms as being mandatory. In this example, I'm saying that the payment is due within 14 days of the invoice date. It's up to you what payment terms you use. That's a really important point. Don't let the company that you're dealing with dictate the invoice terms. It's up to you to negotiate invoice terms with your customer. They will go, especially bigger businesses, they will go for as longer payment terms as physically possible. Sometimes they'll push you to 60 days. Don't let them bully you into having longer payment terms than necessary. Just say, no, sorry, my payment terms are 14 days. Is that okay? If not, then I'm not going ahead with the work. That's something that you need to sort out and negotiate early on in the proceedings. You should be sorting out what your payment terms are well before issuing an invoice. E&OE just means errors and omissions accepted. I don't know how much weight it has in a court of law, but it basically means that if you've made a mistake on your invoice, then you can come back and maybe issue a new invoice. And it just gives you a little bit of extra protection to say, I think everything on here is correct, but if there is a mistake, then I'm entitled to correct that mistake. Good practice to have it on. I would say have it on by default. A link to your own terms and conditions. Now, a lot of companies will put the terms and conditions on the reverse of the invoice, or they might supply it on a separate sheet. When you're first starting out, you probably don't even have terms and conditions. As your business grows, you will start to appreciate the importance of having some terms and conditions in place. For example, telling your customer what happens if they don't pay you on time. So a link to your terms and conditions, I would say, is optional, but sort it out as quickly as you can. It's a good idea to say what payment methods you accept. Again, it's optional, but it's a good idea to include it. Payment by cash, credit card, or bank transfer, or whatever that you happen to accept for your business. And it's also a good idea to have your bank details on the actual invoice. Again, don't give the company you're dealing with any excuses to delay payment, because they will use any excuse to delay payment. Oh, you didn't include your bank details on the invoice. So if you're going to accept bank transfers, at least show your account number, sort code, and what payment reference you want them to use. And then the final thing that you might want to consider adding onto your invoice, this is the only thing I don't include by default on the invoice template that's on Patreon, is a purchase order reference number. We'll talk about this in more detail on a separate video, but to cut a long story short, if the company you're dealing with gives you a purchase order number to use and you don't then show that purchase order number on the invoice that you issue, then you probably won't get paid. So if you've been given a purchase order number to use by your customer, then make sure you show it on the invoice that you raise. If you only deal with consumers, then obviously consumers aren't going to give you a purchase order number. It's a really easy thing to add onto your invoice template. If you need it, add it. If you don't, don't. That covers pretty much everything you're likely to ever encounter when you're raising an invoice for one of your customers, with the exception of anything to do with VAT. And obviously the other thing as well is, if you're a limited company, you should be including your registered limited company details on the invoice as well. But assuming you're a non-VAT registered sole trader, something like this should do the job to get you up and running. So generally speaking, you're only going to be issuing invoices for goods and services that have already been fulfilled. So in other words, you've already done the work or you've already sent out the product. Now, one thing I get asked a lot is, what happens if you want to be paid in advance for a product or service? And generally speaking, that's where a pro forma invoice comes into play. I'm going to do a separate video all about pro forma invoices, so don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'll also make a separate video about credit notes, which are effectively the opposite of an invoice. And also bear in mind that an invoice can kind of be used as a receipt. In most cases, if you've issued an invoice and then the customer has paid you for that invoice, normally the customer won't then also ask you for a receipt for payment. But what you might want to do is just give them a copy of the invoice but have stamped on it paid, or you can just add a line onto the invoice to say when it was paid and how it was paid. You know, you do run into situations like that from time to time. It kind of depends on whether you mostly deal B2B, in other words, business to business, or B2C, which is business to consumer. In the world of B2B, most businesses won't ask for a receipt to prove that they've paid an invoice, because the invoice itself is the tax document that they need on their side. The receipt doesn't really serve much of a purpose for the business that you've dealt with. From a consumer perspective, you might get customers asking for a receipt just for peace of mind to prove that they've paid a particular invoice. Again, it happens, but it's fairly rare these days. Normally there's a paper trail or an electronic paper trail of communication about getting paid, you know, whether it's on text message or on email. So you can kind of prove that things have been settled through other means. So normally it's a little bit pointless also giving them a separate physical receipt, but you might get asked to do that. So it's very easy for you to do. Keep the customer happy. Just do a copy of the invoice and stamp paid on it. So when don't you need to issue an invoice? Well, that's largely up to you and how your business model works. Generally speaking though, if the exchange of goods or services for money happens almost immediately and it's for a relatively low amount of money, then you're not going to give them an invoice. So for example, if you went into a shop and bought a Mars bar, the shop owner isn't going to give you an invoice for 50 pence, which you then give them. But they might give you a receipt, which is kind of an automated thing from their till, but that's different from an invoice. A receipt isn't a demand for payment. A receipt is a thing to say that you've already paid it. Another example might be if you're a music teacher or just a private teacher of any description, and you might do hourly music lessons, let's say. Well, you're not going to invoice the parent or the pupil every time you want to get paid for the lesson, because they're probably going to pay at the time that they have the lesson. What might happen is that they pay for a block of lessons up front, so you might want to invoice them for a block of lessons. Again, normally that's a bit formal for things like music lessons, and normally we'd just send them an email to say, can you transfer £300 to my bank, and then that'll cover you for 10 lessons. That's kind of an invoice, it's just taking a different format. You know, invoices don't have to follow this very structured format. If you're dealing with businesses though, they will expect that the invoice follows a more structured format. And if you don't give them a structured, properly written invoice, they might not pay you. So the main thing is, as the value of the goods or services decrease, and if it's pretty much an immediate transaction, then the level of detail required on invoices kind of diminishes to the point where the invoice disappears and it's more or less just replaced with a receipt. You still need to be keeping good accounting records of all your sales, but again, you're probably not going to be logging things like the customer name and the customer address and all sorts of details like that. Just think about what happens if you go into a shop. Even if you're buying a potentially fairly high value item, say for example you go into a hi-fi shop, you might spend 2 or 3 grand on hi-fi equipment. The transaction happens straight away, but they're not asking for your name and address, other than perhaps for marketing purposes, but that's not a tax requirement. But you do obviously need to record those sales, what you sold and how much and when and all that sort of thing. As per usual, if you're in any doubt about this sort of stuff, speak to your accountant and they will help you and they will point you in the right direction with invoices. You might want to show them one of your invoices and how you're doing it, and they'll say, yeah, that's fine. Or they might say, oh, you should have really included this bit of information on it. They will have a much better understanding of the kind of detail of how your business is run. So they're the best person to ask. Finally, let's have a look at my favourite invoice numbering system. Now, this might not work if you're VAT registered, because there's some weird rules surrounding VAT and having sequential invoice numbers and all sorts of ridiculous bureaucracy surrounding that. But if you're not VAT registered, I can't find any reason for not doing it this way. And my favourite way of picking an invoice number is to take the invoice date and reverse it. So if the invoice date was the 1st of June 2019, then your invoice number would become 190601. Now, you might generate more than one invoice per day, so you do need a way of keeping your invoice numbers unique. So for that reason, I add a letter on the end. Normally it's a letter A, but if you've generated more than one invoice on that particular day, then your next one would be a letter B, the next one letter C, etc., etc. It still is sequential, but it's not sequential in the way that VAT might demand it to be sequential. I really like this invoice numbering system, because if you name your invoice files as 190601A, then it means that when you sort them, then they're all automatically in date order. The other big advantage is that just by glancing at the file name, you know the date that that invoice was generated. The only disadvantage really, other than the VAT thing, is that it's a bit of a manual process for putting your invoice numbering together. I haven't seen automated systems for doing an invoice number like this. I'm sure they might exist somewhere. But if you're just a self-employed sole trader and you're not VAT registered and you're not generating millions of invoices, I find this invoice numbering system works much better than a sequential number. I hope that's all been useful for you. Remember, next time we're going to have a little look at pro forma invoices. Until then, I wish you every success with your own business, and I shall see you next time. Bye!